I have spent a long time trying to decide where this story begins. It could begin the morning my father was diagnosed. It could begin the night I canceled a flight to Rome, a trip I'd been planning for 2 years. Because he had a procedure and Margaret had a conflict, and Jason wasn't answering his phone. It could begin 12 years ago, or 6, or 2. But I think it actually begins on a Tuesday morning in November, in a lawyer's office that smelled like old carpet and filtered air. When a man I'd never met read my father's final wishes aloud to a room full of people. He read for 45 minutes. He said my stepmother's name. He said my brother's name. He said the names of charities, of distant relatives, of a hospital foundation my father had supported for 20 years. He did not say my name. Not once, not in passing, not in a single sentence. I sat in that room, and I listened to 45 minutes of my father's documented love, distributed to people who had done far less than I had. And I thought about hospital chairs and canceled vacations, and the particular weight of a hand that reaches for yours in the dark because it's afraid. And I thought, so this is what 12 years is worth. I want to tell you what happened after, but first I need to tell you what 12 years actually looked like. My father was diagnosed with heart failure when I was 29. The cardiologist explained it carefully, the way doctors explain things when they want to be honest without being frightening. Manageable, he said. With proper care, monitoring, medication compliance, lifestyle adjustment. Manageable. What he didn't say, what nobody says in those appointments, is that manageable is not the same as easy. Manageable means someone has to manage it. Manageable means medication schedules and dietary restrictions and quarterly echocardiograms and the kind of ongoing vigilance that doesn't announce itself but never actually stops. My mother had died when I was 17. There was no one to share the management with except Margaret, who had married my father when I was 23, and who was attentive in the way of someone auditioning for a role they've already decided they don't want permanently. In the early years, she came to appointments. She filled prescriptions. She did the visible parts. But Margaret had a particular sensitivity to inconvenience. As my father's condition became more complex, as the appointments grew longer, as the hospital stays began, as the management required more than could be accomplished during business hours, Margaret's availability narrowed, and I expanded to fill the gap. I was a registered nurse, which made me the practical choice in a way that went unspoken but was always understood. I knew how to talk to his cardiologist. I knew what the numbers on his monitors meant, what questions to push on, what side effects to watch for. I was calm in clinical environments. I did not panic. I moved to an apartment 12 minutes from my father's house when I was 31. I reorganized my shift schedule to keep Tuesdays and Thursdays available for appointments. I gave the building super my father's address as a secondary contact, in case anything happened, and I needed to leave quickly. I built my entire life around the outer edge of his illness, without fully realizing I was doing it until the shape was already set. There were good years inside the hard ones. I want to say that clearly because I don't want you to think it was only sacrifice. My father was a good man, quiet, observant, the kind of person who paid attention without making a performance of it. We talked during those drives to appointments in a way we never had when I was young. He asked me things. He remembered what I told him. There was a version of closeness we found in those years that I don't think we would have found any other way. But there were also the nights I slept in a hospital chair because his oxygen levels kept dropping and the staffing was thin, and I couldn't leave him alone with the uncertainty of it. There was the promotion I turned down, a senior position that would have required travel, substantial raise, the kind of opportunity that comes once. Because my father had a procedure scheduled, and I was the one who needed to be there. There were the relationships I let go quiet because I never had enough left over. Never had the bandwidth to be present in the way someone deserves when they're trying to build something with you. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was doing what any child would do. Neither of those things was entirely true. Jason was 7 years younger than me. He'd been 22 when our father was diagnosed, young enough that some of the early absence was forgivable, young enough that building a career in another city made a kind of sense. He worked in finance in San Francisco. He was good-looking in the way that made people assume competence, charming in the way that made people forgive gaps. He called on Sundays. He visited at Christmas and in good years in summer. He sent thoughtful gifts when our father had procedures, the right whiskey, the right book, the gesture that communicated care without requiring presence. He was not a bad person. I want to be careful about that. He was a person who had allowed distance to become habit, and then allowed habit to become identity. Until the story he told about himself, devoted son, just geographically challenged, had been repeated often enough that he believed it. And our father, who wanted to believe it, helped him maintain the fiction. Margaret helped too. That was the thing I understood only gradually. When Jason canceled, which was often, which was predictable, which I had stopped being surprised by around year 4, Margaret would smooth it over with our father. She would explain. She would reframe. She would ensure that my father's disappointment never calcified into anything that might complicate his relationship with the son who had the correct last name, and the easy smile, and no particular interest in the parts of loving someone that were inconvenient. The clearest example came in February of the 7th year. My father had a stress test scheduled, a significant one, a follow-up after a hospitalization the previous month that had frightened all of us. Jason had promised to come. He'd booked a flight, confirmed it twice, called our father to say he was looking forward to seeing him. The night before, a snowstorm closed the Seattle airport. My apartment was 40 miles south, outside the closure zone. I drove through 4 hours of ice and reduced visibility with a bag I'd packed in 15 minutes. I arrived at the hospital at 6 in the morning and sat in the waiting room until the test was done, and the results came back, and my father was discharged with a new medication and instructions to rest. Jason called that afternoon. He'd gone to a golf trip in Phoenix with colleagues. The weather window had opened. The flight south was fine. It seemed like a shame to waste the weekend. He sent a fruit basket to the hospital, addressed to Margaret. My father said, "It's fine, he has a lot going on." I nodded. I did not say what I was thinking. I drove home in the dark. In the last year of my father's life, something changed. His health had deteriorated to the point where hospital visits were no longer occasional events, but recurring ones, where certain appointments required overnight stays, where the question was no longer management, but something with a less comfortable name. He knew it. We didn't talk about it directly. That wasn't how either of us operated. But the knowledge was present in rooms between us, in the particular quality of his silences, in the way he sometimes held my hand longer than necessary when I dropped him home. He began meeting with his lawyer. I found this out not from him, but from a calendar notification I saw on his phone while helping him with a prescription refill. Gerald Hoover, Thursday, 2 p.m. The notation was brief and gave nothing away, but when I mentioned it casually, "I didn't know you had an appointment Thursday," he looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Just some paperwork," he said. He said it in a way that closed the subject. Around the same time, Margaret became, I'm searching for the right word, territorial. Not dramatically. Margaret never did anything dramatically, but she began involving herself in my father's correspondence more directly, positioning herself between him and his mail, excusing herself from rooms he was in, and reappearing 10 minutes later with a reason that seemed, on reflection, slightly prepared. Financial documents disappeared. Not obviously, not in a way that created immediate alarm. But twice I noticed paperwork on his desk that had been there the day before and was not there when I came back. Once I asked my father directly about a statement I'd seen, and he looked briefly uncertain before saying he thought Margaret had filed it somewhere. He also became more deliberate in certain conversations. I was leaving one evening after a long appointment day, and he stopped me at the door. He held my hand the way he did sometimes and looked at me with that particular attention and said, "Not everyone in this family is who they pretend to be." I asked him what he meant. He shook his head slowly. "Just, I want you to know that I see you. I've always seen you." I told him I knew that. I'm not sure I believed it then. He died on a Sunday in late September. I had stayed the night before because his breathing had been irregular, and I didn't want to be a 40-minute drive away if something changed. I was awake when it happened, not at his side, but close enough that, when I heard the change in the quality of the silence, I knew immediately. I was the one who called the paramedics. I was the one who held his hand until they arrived. I was the one who sat in the hospital afterward and made the calls and answered the questions and signed the forms. Margaret arrived 90 minutes later. She came in looking composed, which I did not hold against her. People grieve differently. Jason flew in from San Francisco 2 days before the funeral. He was visibly undone, genuinely, I believe genuinely, in the way of someone who has kept grief at a long arm's length for years, and then found it waiting for them at the door one morning anyway. He gave a speech at the service that made people cry. He talked about fishing trips and Sunday phone calls and a father who always believed in him. It was a good speech. It was also the most time he'd spent thinking about our father in any concentrated way in years, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so. Afterward, in the receiving line, people kept coming up to Jason. They shook his hand. They told him his father would be proud. They said he'd clearly inherited his father's strength. A few people came to me, squeezed my arm, said things like you were such a help to him, and he was lucky to have you nearby. Help nearby, as if I'd been a convenient resource rather than a daughter. I smiled and thanked them and went to find more coffee. The will reading was 6 weeks later. Gerald Hoover's office occupied the second floor of a building downtown. Beige carpet, a conference table that seated 8, a window overlooking a parking lot. Margaret arrived with Jason. They came together, which registered somewhere in my mind as a detail. Margaret wore gray. Jason wore the expression of a man trying to appear appropriately somber while clearly expecting good news. We sat. Gerald Hoover arranged his papers. He offered water. He began. The house, the home my father had owned for 31 years, where I had grown up, where I still had a key I'd used 1,000 times, went to Margaret outright, no conditions. The investment accounts, 3 of them, totaling a sum that Gerald Hoover read aloud in a voice that did not change, went to Jason. A trust fund was established for Jason's 2 children, a donation to the hospital foundation, a watch to my uncle, books to a former colleague, a small sum to a neighbor who had helped with the yard. Gerald Hoover turned the page. He kept reading. I kept waiting. He finished. He set the document down. He said, "That concludes the primary provisions of the will." Primary. I turned the word over. The room was quiet. My uncle was looking at his hands. Jason was looking at the window with the careful blankness of a man who had gotten what he expected and was performing discomfort about it. Margaret was looking at Gerald Hoover with the composed satisfaction of someone watching a plan execute correctly. She did not look at me. I became aware slowly that no one was looking at me. 45 minutes. Every asset, every dollar, every personal effect my father had spent a lifetime accumulating. Distributed to a woman who had managed his paperwork and a son who had called on Sundays and distant relatives and charitable foundations. Not me. Not a dollar, not a keepsake, not a sentence. 12 years, hospital chairs, canceled flights. The hand I held in the dark. The voice on the other end of the phone every time something went wrong. Not one word. I stood up. My legs worked. I was mildly surprised. I picked up my coat, my bag. I thought about my car in the parking lot. I thought about the drive home. I was already arranging the hours ahead in the methodical way I arranged things when I didn't trust my emotions to behave in public. I walked toward the door. "Ms. Bennett." I stopped. Gerald Hoover's voice was quiet, not urgent, just clear. "I'd ask you not to leave the building just yet," he said, "if you're willing." I turned around. He was looking at me with an expression that was different from the one he'd worn for the past 45 minutes. Something careful in it. Something that had been waiting. "5 minutes," he said, "please." I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I came back to the table and sat down. I drove home in silence. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning on any lights, watching the afternoon move through the window and the shadows lengthen across the floor. My phone started ringing around 5. My aunt, a cousin, my father's neighbor, the one who'd gotten the sum in the will. I let them all go to voicemail. The texts were worse in some ways because they required no response and arrived anyway. "Just heard, so sorry. Your father would have had his reasons. Don't do anything rash." Don't do anything rash. I thought about rash. I thought about what rash would even look like from me, who had spent 12 years not doing anything rash, who had absorbed and adjusted and managed and prioritized everyone else's needs so completely that I had lost the thread of what my own actually were. My brother called at 7. I answered, "I don't know why." "I didn't know," he said immediately. His voice was strange, strained, not the smooth Jason I was used to. I want you to know I didn't know you weren't in it." "Okay," I said. "That wasn't Dad wouldn't have." "Jason," my voice came out very even. "I don't want to talk about this tonight." A pause. "Okay, yeah, okay." He hung up. My aunt called again. This time I picked up. "Emily, sweetheart," her voice was warm and careful. "I know this is hard, but your father was a complicated man, and these decisions are never." "Did you know?" I asked. A pause. "Well, he didn't discuss it with me directly. Did you have any sense that I wasn't included?" Another pause, longer. "Your father knew what he was doing," she said finally. "I'm sure there are reasons." I'm sure there are too, I said. I just don't know what they are. I ended the call. I sat in the dark for a while longer. Then I thought about what Gerald Hoover had said to me at the door, when everyone else had left, when it was just the two of us in that beige carpeted room. Your father left something outside the primary will. I can't discuss it here, not today. But I'd like you to come to my office on Thursday. Come alone. I turned the lights on. I wrote Thursday in my calendar. I did not sleep well. The days between Tuesday and Thursday were some of the hardest I can remember. Not because I was angry. Anger I could have worked with. Anger has direction. What I felt was closer to the bottom of something. A place where the ground you assumed was solid turns out to have been temporary, and you find yourself reviewing the entire landscape of the past 12 years looking for what else you misread. Did he love me? The question kept arriving regardless of how many times I told myself it was the wrong question, too simple, too childish for a 41-year-old woman. But it kept arriving. I thought about the drive to the hospital in the snowstorm. I thought about the nights in the chair. I thought about the way his hand pressed mine. I thought about all the evidence I had assembled over 12 years for the conclusion that my father saw me and valued me and would, when the time came, find a way to say so. A will is a man's final word. A will is the document that survives him and speaks for him and tells everyone who mattered. And I was not in it, not in a footnote, not in a sentence. Completely, totally, officially absent. Maybe I had been wrong about all of it. Maybe I had constructed a version of our relationship from the materials I needed it to be made of. And the true version, the official version, the one that would outlast both of us, said something different. Maybe the 12 years had been mine. My choice, my need, my inability to accept that love wasn't something you earned through availability. Maybe he had simply let me do it because I was willing, and had felt what any decent person feels when someone helps them: gratitude, warmth, appreciation, without it ever being the thing I had decided it was. That thought sat in my chest like a stone for 2 days. On Wednesday evening, Jason called again. Margaret said there's a trust for the grandchildren, he said. He was working up to something. I know, I was there. Look, Em, whatever you're thinking about contesting, I'm not contesting anything, because Dad had the right to leave his estate however he... Jason, I kept my voice level. I told you I'm not contesting anything. I need you to hear that. A pause. Okay, he sounded less certain than he had at the start of the call. Okay, good. I wanted to make sure we're on the same page. We are, I said. I hung up. I wondered who had asked him to make that call. Gerald Hoover's office was empty on Thursday afternoon except for the two of us. No Margaret, no Jason, no relatives with careful expressions. He offered coffee. I accepted it. He set a folder on the table and folded his hands over it. Your father and I met 8 times in the last 14 months of his life, he said. The first appointment was to update the primary will, the one we read on Tuesday. The subsequent 7 appointments were for other purposes. He opened the folder. Inside were photocopies, financial documents, handwritten notes, what appeared to be excerpts from a journal, several pages of carefully annotated records. Your father was aware that his judgment was being influenced, Gerald said, choosing the word carefully. He documented specific instances, missing correspondence, paperwork presented to him during periods when his medication made him less clear-headed than usual, financial transfers he did not initiate but found evidence of after the fact. He slid 3 pages across the table. I looked at them. Transfer records. Modest amounts individually, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, but consistent, spanning 2 years, all moving from accounts I recognized into an account I didn't. He couldn't prove intent, Gerald said. He was explicit about that. He didn't want to make accusations he couldn't substantiate, but he wanted the record to exist. He gave it to me for safekeeping. Why are you showing me this now? I asked. Because he asked me to. Gerald reached into the folder again and produced a sealed envelope. My name on the front, my father's handwriting. He wrote this letter 8 months ago. His instructions were to give it to you at a private meeting following the reading of the primary will. He wanted you to have heard the primary will first. He was very specific about the sequence. I looked at the envelope. My name, his handwriting. The loops of the letters exactly as I remembered from birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter when I was small. Would you like a moment? Gerald asked. No, I said, read it. He opened the envelope. He unfolded the letter, 3 pages handwritten dense. He cleared his throat. And my father came back into the room. Emily, I've thought about how to begin this letter for months, and I keep coming back to the same problem. Everything I want to say should have been said out loud in person while I still had time to say it correctly. The fact that I'm saying it this way, through Gerald, in a room you'll sit in after I'm gone, is a failure I have to live with, except of course that I won't live with it at all. You will. And I'm sorry for that. I need to tell you what I knew. I knew every appointment, every drive, every night you rearranged something in your own life to manage something in mine. I knew about the Denver position. I heard you on the phone with your colleague, the night you turned it down, and I heard you say it was your choice. And I heard the particular quality of silence after you hung up that I recognized because I have heard you be brave about disappointment your entire life. I knew when you drove through the snowstorm in February. I knew because I watched you walk into that hospital at 6 in the morning with your hair still wet and a bag you'd clearly packed in 15 minutes, and I thought, there is no one in the world who does this for a person unless they love them. And I thought, I have to find a way to say that to her. I didn't find the way, not in person. I was never good at the direct version of saying things. Your mother used to tell me that. She said I showed love like a man who'd been told showing it directly was somehow embarrassing. She was right. I was trying to get better at it toward the end. I'm not sure I succeeded. What I want you to understand about the will, the one you heard Tuesday morning, is that it was not my whole intention. It was a document produced under circumstances I've described to Gerald in detail, during a period when my judgment was being managed by people who had strong opinions about outcomes. I signed things I should not have signed. I allowed certain things to happen that I should not have allowed. I am not blaming anyone else for my failures. I made choices. But I want you to know the context, because I think you deserve to have it. 2 years ago, when I understood what was happening clearly enough to act, I took the steps I could take. Gerald helped me establish a separate trust, outside the primary estate, legally distinct, not subject to the will or anything in it. I transferred the cabin at Miller Lake into it. The investment accounts I'd set aside under my own name for the last decade, the ones nobody else knew about, went into it. The cabin is yours. It has been in your grandmother's family since before I was born. You used to ask to go there every summer. You learned to swim off that dock. I have not been able to get up there in 3 years, and I have thought about it often. About you up there. About what it would mean for you to have a place that is entirely yours, with no negotiation and no conditions. The investment accounts are not a fortune, but they are real. Gerald will explain the figures. More importantly, and I need you to hear me say this clearly, none of it is payment. I am not trying to pay you for 12 years. I don't think 12 years can be paid for, and I don't think you did what you did because you expected payment. That is one of the things I know about you that I should have said more often. You did it because you loved the way your mother loved, completely, without negotiation, without keeping score. And the people in your life, myself included, have spent a long time accepting that love and not always returning it in the currency it deserved. I want to tell you something I should have told you when I was alive to watch you receive it. You were the only person who loved me when loving me was difficult. Not because it was your job, not because you were nearby, not because you had nothing better to do, because you chose it. Every single time for 12 years you chose it. I see that, I have always seen it. I should have made sure you knew. The cabin is waiting for you. There's a lockbox under the 3rd floorboard in the bedroom. You remember, we hid birthday presents there when you were small. Inside you'll find 3 journals. I kept them for the last 4 years. They say things I couldn't say with Margaret in the house. Read them when you're ready. Or don't, that's yours too. I love you, Emily. I love you in the way a father loves a child who turned out to be braver than he ever managed to be. I'm sorry it took me this long. Dad. Gerald set the letter down. The room was quiet. I sat with my hands flat on the table, looking at the handwriting on the top page, his particular loops. The way he always wrote my name with the letters slightly closer together than the rest. Something I'd never consciously noticed before. I didn't cry in Gerald's office. I don't know why. I was full of something too large for tears, something that needed more space than that room afforded, more time than that afternoon contained. I asked Gerald about the trust. He explained it carefully. The cabin free and clear, the investment portfolio not transformative but real, enough. I asked if it could be contested. It was established 2 years ago, he said. It's legally distinct from the estate. Your father made certain of it. I nodded. I picked up the letter. Gerald said I could take it, and I folded it and put it in my bag with both hands. Margaret called twice that evening. I let it ring. Jason called once. I let it ring. My aunt sent a text that said Gerald told me there's been a development. I hope you'll be thoughtful about how you handle this. I put my phone face down. In the morning, I loaded my car and drove 4 hours north. The cabin at Miller Lake was smaller than memory had made it. The porch listed slightly to one side. The dock needed boards replaced. The kitchen was 30 years out of date. The walls carried a watermark from some long-ago flood, and the whole place smelled like pine and cold and something specific I had not encountered anywhere else in my life. I stood on the porch and looked at the lake for a long time. Then I went inside, went to the bedroom, counted the floorboards, and lifted the third one. The lockbox was exactly where it had always been. 3 journals, an investment summary from Gerald's office. A small envelope unsealed, my name on the front. I sat on the bedroom floor and opened the small envelope last. A photograph. The 2 of us at Miller Lake, me at 8 years old, soaking wet from the lake, grinning at something off camera. My father behind me mid-laugh, completely unguarded in the way he almost never was in photographs. On the back, in his handwriting, she never needed anyone to tell her she was capable. She already knew. I should have made sure she knew she was loved. I sat on that floor for a long time. Outside, the pines moved in the wind. The lake was flat and gray and enormous and entirely still. I had spent 12 years being the capable one, the available one, the one who showed up when showing up was hard. I had spent 2 days believing that none of it had mattered, that I had constructed a relationship from the materials I needed it to be made of rather than the ones that were actually there. The photograph was in my hands. The letter was in my bag. He had known. He had been watching the whole time. He had not said it the way I needed. Not in the years when it would have sustained me through the hard parts. Not in the moments when I sat in parking lots and hospital corridors, wondering why the people who were supposed to see me clearly seemed to look right through me instead. But he had said it, and it was true. I could feel that it was true. I opened the first journal. The light through the bedroom window was long and gold, the late afternoon kind that makes everything look a little more bearable than it might otherwise be. The lake was going silver at the edges. I sat in my father's cabin, in the room where we had hidden birthday presents under the floorboards, and I read his handwriting for hours. And for the first time since the morning I'd called the paramedics and understood that he was gone, for the first time in all the weeks of arrangements and funerals and beige-carpeted offices and phone calls I didn't answer. I felt something in my chest loosen. Not healed, not finished, just at peace. The kind of peace that comes when you finally have the answer to the question you'd been afraid to ask. He saw me. He always had.